in order to invoke a national emergency, a government needs to have the grounds to show that there is either espionage, sabotage, serious acts of violence, or a plot to overthrow the government. Now, in the Commission's report, they have said, we want to remove these four stipulations.
Educated in political science, religious studies, and history, my guest today, Ray McGinnis, is an accomplished writer who has a passion to investigate the stories that we tell, the ones that we ignore, and how this shapes our worldviews as a society. He's with me today to discuss his recent expose on the Public Order Emergency Commission's findings after the Freedom Convoy and where past governments have exploited crisis in order to craft a strategic narrative. Every Canadian deserves to know the backstory and the whole story.
Today, a special episode of Return to Reason, where knowledge and wisdom intersect.
Well, Ray, thank you so much for joining me today on Return to Reason. It's really good to have you here.
Thanks very much, David.
Today, I'm excited to chat with you about this. You attended the Public Order Emergencies Commission, the public inquiry regarding the Freedom Convoy that happened last year in our nation, January and February of 2022. Let me know, from you attending and watching that happen, what was your results? What conclusions did you come to regarding the public inquiry?
So I watched the inquiry, throughout the 6 weeks, and as I was watching the testimony, I was motivated to fly to Ottawa and to be there for 1 week and sit through the testimony. And my takeaway from listening to police and intelligence officials and listening to senior government officials and cabinet ministers is that no one in police or intelligence, RCMP, asked the government to invoke the Emergencies Act, although we were told by the Prime Minister and Marco Mendocino and others that we've invoked the act because we've been asked to by policing and intelligence authorities. The testimony of National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Jody Thomas, was critical as she was, acknowledging the four tests of what the triggers are to invoke the national emergency. And the Emergencies Act would be sabotage, espionage, foreign interference, actual acts of serious violence, and a plot to overthrow the government. And it's no. But when she gets to actual, serious violence, she swaps out the word serious for continual. And starts explaining, well, there was honking, there was pollution. So there, what the government seemed to do was to look at the Emergencies Act legislation and to say there's these strict requirements regarding what a trigger would be. We're just going to expand that, and we're going to have get some legal advice that tells us that we think that we can invoke the Emergencies Act, notwithstanding what it specifically says. And so when Attorney General David Lametti is on the stand, he's asked about the advice, and he says that he's got a solicitor-client privilege, and so he can't speak about what the advice is. And so really we are left as a nation with a government deciding to draw a much bigger circle around what should trigger a national emergency, and say we've drawn a bigger circle around the parameters for what a national emergency would be, and we have legal advice, but it's a secret and we can't tell you.
So with the initial Public Order Emergency Commission, what was the initial goal of that? Is it just to unearth information, or could have been there actually legal precedent that came out of it?
Well, it's a commission that provides guidance to the Parliament. I don't know what legal. It may be looked to by. There may be. There's the civil case with Ottawa residents against some protesters regarding the noise and everything. Maybe a judge will look to the conclusions in the commission report and say, well, the commissioner said, based on everything I've listened to, I'm going to decide to say the government was, right, basically, to go ahead and invoke the emergency. And maybe a judge in a civil court would refer to that as part of their ruling. I don't know, but that might be what would happen. But these things are they're looked upon as sort of setting a precedent.
Yes.
And even if it doesn't have, I mean, Justice Paul Rouleau couldn't recommend, there was no legal, nothing that's going to go to court regarding this. This is not a court of law. And so the way it's conducted throughout, you have the government with its 20 lawyers or so. They've had many months to get ready to provide documents that are required for the commission to do its work. And throughout the commission, you have people who are testifying, different cabinet ministers, the prime minister, and the government lawyers are dumping hundreds of documents into the laptops of other lawyers that want to cross-examine. So this is, in a normal judicial setting, you would have an adjournment, and the other lawyers can look at the new documents and see what questions they want to craft to ask the person on the witness stand. But that was not what this was.
It seems that government-appointed commissions are becoming more and more contentious as of recent. Is there a benefit to going through that process still, or is that being corrupted, might be too strong of a word, or is it inefficient in terms of how it's actually being conducted?
In the best of possible worlds, a commission, like inquiry into salmon fishing on the West Coast or other things in the past, transportation routes and the railroads and so on, a commission has a sober look at a topic and comes out with some recommendations, and the parliament takes them and passes legislation. But with this particular commission, you have a chief justice, you have Justice Rouleau, who has been appointed by the prime minister. Paul Rouleau had a long, history with close connection with the Liberal Party of Canada, serving as an executive assistant for former Liberal Prime Minister John Turner in the 1980s, and was certainly involved in the campaign, I think, in 1984. And so there's a real disconnect between, wanting to have an independent inquiry, because the biggest concern is that, the government can't really investigate itself. And there was good cross-examination throughout this commission, but yet there was. It's surprising reading the. I haven't read all 2,000 pages, but for example, Patrick Morris, the inspector for the key intelligence inspector for the Ottawa Provincial Police, is saying that there was no credible threat, that on the 14th, the day of the invocation by the prime minister, there was peaceful, not a threat to a passerby, and so on. Lots of that kind of comment, and no assaults, no looting, no bombing, and so in the report, Justice Rouleau will wave away that kind of serious comment based on lots of evidence from police officers on the ground checking out to see whether or not this is a violent or a peaceful assembly. And instead, Rouleau will point to the testimony of a couple of Ottawa residents who at the most could point to being traumatized by the honking. One called it phantom honking. So no actual assault, physical assault based on the criminal code. So he's.
Well, Ray, the interesting thing is, like, I was on ground firsthand for about 2.5 weeks in Ottawa. Myself and Jeremy, who also co-hosts Return to Reason, we were there. And we basically went out last minute to catch up with a convoy, not in support of any one side, but to literally try to show what was happening on the streets every day. We were live streaming multiple times a day, probably 8 to 10 update videos every day. We were at the center of it. And our experience there was very different than what the media was portraying, or even the verbiage that was coming from our government. Very different. And I can actually attest to what you're talking about in terms of public complaining about honking in those areas. Is there's actually a small section of the convoy that was actually in a residential area. And I know there was efforts because I was part of trying to cover these conversations and chats with the quote unquote convoy leadership. I know there's multiple people that probably deem themselves self-leaders of it, but trying to work with the city to actually move trucks away because they believe their right to protest, they also did not want to disturb or did not have a heart to mess with people that were living their day-to-day lives. So it's just interesting the difference in messaging that actually came out of reality versus what I think media wanted to portray. That's just my opinion or my 2 cents.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I've heard from numbers of people who were there, who were Ottawa residents too. One who was right downtown, a guy called David, who did a blog about going out on the 3rd of February. So, the trucks are arriving, a few of them on the 28th, most people arriving on the 29th. So 29th, 30th, 31st, 1st, and 2nd. By the 3rd, he's saying that there's no honking after 6 p.m.
Yeah.
Now, may have been not within earshot and maybe somewhere else. There might have been some honking, but that's interesting. And also you have an agreement by the 5th of February, just sort of ahead of I'm guessing it was a virtual meeting with Justice Hugh McLean on the 7th of February, where they'd said we're going to make sure we don't honk outside of 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and then the justice said no honking at all. And Tom Marazzo said they went around with the road captains, block captains, and said, yes, if there are any people who insist on honking, warn them that if you don't stop honking, we're going to cut your cables to your air horn.
Yeah.
So they took the protest leaders took the injunction very seriously. And when the injunction was extended on the 16th of February by the provincial court judge, clearly he was satisfied that his insistence that the honking stop had been met. Maybe there was a honk here or honk there somewhere, different parts of the day, but the blaring nonstop honking that had been happening, annoying, understandably, everybody, including people in the protest, had stopped after the 7th of February. Denise Batters, the senator from Saskatchewan, who has her offices right on Wellington Street, talked in her in the Senate against the invocation, and said that the honking had long stopped, before, and that besides, honking of horns, as the RCMP in their text messages will tell you, entered as evidence in the commission, is not a basis for invoking an Emergencies Act.
Yeah, and that's where this giant discrepancy comes up, because it's interesting, even talking to family members and close friends of mine, people who weren't on the ground, who get their information from media, watching mainstream legacy media, is that I actually had some friends and family upset with me just for being down there, thinking a part of this racist, bigoted, hatred, overthrowing the government type of rally, even though I wasn't a part of the rally, but I did attend. And the difference of information that comes out. So I want to ask you a question is, in your opinion, would you use the word collusion between government and media to portray certain messaging around this to prop up the idea of using the Emergencies Act? Was that a case in the fallout of the convoy?
Well, we have a prime minister who has run on a reputation of being inclusive and tolerant of everybody, who's willing to sit down and listen to everybody. And back in 2020, when First Nations protesters were protesting and stopped Via Rail and CN Rail for over a month, and all of that went on for 11 weeks. And throughout all of that, the prime minister said, "Well, we need to have dialogue."
Yeah.
So this complete reversal 2 years later, and there were text messages between Mary Liz Powers and the PMO's office with, I think, Adam Cohen, with the public safety minister, Marco Mendocino's assistant. I think on the, the Liberal cabinet was going into a retreat on the 24th, so probably late on the 23rd, on the Sunday of January. They're saying, we're going to, make this out to be kind of a January 6th North, frame them as, so, let's make sure that Marco Mendocino doesn't say anything too early. And we also want to make sure we got some people in Global who can run with this narrative, but we don't want to say Marco Mendocino to say anything too incendiary. He doesn't want to drive out the crazies, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So and Rupa Subramanya, who's an independent reporter who with the National Post and other media outlets, who lives 5-minute walk from where the protest was, and she visited every day, 2-3 times a day, and interviewed hundreds of people. And she said that it was clear that there was this received narrative, and she talks about how by the time the protesters arrived, she talks about she's following the mainstream news, and she says she has all this quote stuff in her head, and so she went to see if this stuff in her head was relatable at all to what was actually happening.
Yeah.
And it's almost to me like back in the fall, in the winter of 2021. The RCMP had been there was a report on the RCMP, and they'd chastised the RCMP for its work environment, for being homophobic and racist and misogynist. And it's almost like somebody took the key points of the report damning the RCMP's behavior and the culture and sort of just lathered it onto the protesters.
Yeah, it is really interesting to see the difference, the fallout, I should say, difference of opinions that still stand. Just to clarify, what was the result of the public inquiry? What was the final statement or the final verdict, so to speak?
So the public inquiry said, reluctantly, in quotes, the Commissioner Rouleau said reluctantly, the government was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act. And I think it may be the most significant thing too, is that where the 1988 legislation of the Emergencies Act stipulated that in order to invoke a national emergency, a government needs to have the grounds to show that there is either espionage, sabotage, serious acts of violence, or a plot to overthrow the government. Now, in the Commission's report, they have said we want to remove these 4 stipulations and leave it to the government in the future to if they have a sense, if there's a perception that there is a national emergency. We won't have any kind of anchors to ground in reality what that sense could be. Catastrophizing, a bad night's sleep, a long history of anxiety disorder that's maybe not been diagnosed, and off you go. So
that's not based in logic, not based in fact. It's essentially based in feelings, which makes it a useful tool, depending who's at the helm of it.
And there seemed to be, on the best way of looking at it, within the cabinet and the senior government officials, there was groupthink and catastrophizing.
Yes.
You've got a quarter of the protesters have their children with them. You've got thousands of children, I think,
all over,
all over. They're playing. They're making snow sculptures.
It felt like a Canada Day carnival in wintertime at different days. Slides, haystacks, families all around, balloons, food. Just so you know, like that's the feeling was when you walked on the street day to day, in my opinion. But that's what it felt like. Yeah,
people playing chess.
Yes.
and
street hockey, like Canadian fashion. I took part in the street hockey ball game. It was true Canadianism at its best there.
So you have children in their trucks with their parents eating a samosa or a cheeseburger or a ham sandwich. Uh, and and you have Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council, Natalie Drouin, explaining about why there needed to be the Emergency Act invoked. She said, well, there were children being used as human shields.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kind of reporting maybe that comes out of, I don't know, Rwanda
Sure.
or Bangladesh. I mean, there were no human shields,
Yeah.
and the from Denise Batters and others who were walking through the protest between their offices in Wellington Street over to the Parliament buildings, to the Senate chambers, or to the, the Parliament was meeting for days throughout
Yes.
all of this.
Yeah.
If there were, I mean, I could write an article giving some advice to what actual protesters that want to have a coup should do, and it wouldn't be to sit in their trucks or to do the Macarena or to do conga lines. Kidnap somebody, but no,
Sure.
none of that's happening at all.
No.
It's the again with Patrick Morris and Carson Party and others, the extreme lack of violence. There were what, 5 arrests for assault that Eva Chipiuk, one of the convoy lawyers, points out that we still don't know to this day who those 5 people were who were arrested concurrent to the protests in downtown Ottawa, because the police haven't released the names. And it would seem to me that in a media environment where people are really looking for some protester to say, well, here's what they've done, they would want to find someone who's done something more serious than Tamara Lich, who is charged for counseling mischief.
Well, and even on that note, people I followed up with that you've connected with down there who, as the RCMP and the different police forces moved in to remove the convoys, and there was lots of mass arrests, people being dragged out of their trucks, put on buses. There's so many stories coming out of that pulled on the buses, cuffed or arrested, then dropped off other places. Some charges were laid. I know a couple people personally that they're going through, and they have been going through their court proceedings over the last 2-3 weeks, going to Ottawa to be, and the ones that I know, their charges are just being dropped. It's just being thrown out the window. I know one guy that has to come back because he was the very first one, and I had a conversation with him, and he just feels his is going to be thrown out as well, because that seems to be the pattern a year later.
I think that what this whole story, I mean, I've the article you've read is going to become an ebook about 60% longer than the original, and I've reflected on a number of things, and one of them is that what happened in China in the Tiananmen Square. This is about the media again. I saw BBC reporters, I think, that were, passed on to the CBC News, as showing us what was happening with the Chinese army shooting randomly at unarmed citizens, unarmed students. And this is the BBC's story. It was also what the Voice of America was reporting. That the protesters were idealistic students that wanted to liberalize democracy in China, and that was it. And yet the state media in China was saying that these people were criminals, ruffians, and anarchists who hated China and were, foreign influence to agitate against the Chinese government. And you have Chinese Naomi Wolf, who writes in her book The End of America, and she talks about how you have Chinese citizens struggling, if they're aware of what the Voice of America was reporting, and they would consider that, and then they would listen again to the Politburo and the state media, and they would decide, no, the Voice of America is wrong, and the Politburo state media is right. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very difficult if all of the mainstream media are on the same page and repeating the same talking points over and over again about white supremacists. I go there. I mean, there are First Nations people who are listening, some people who were in the protest. I mean, I know that there were numbers of people who were invited, who were proposed by different groups to testify before the commission, who were First Nations women, at least 3, and the commission denied them the opportunity to speak. And it's just so odd because you have a government that's just a year ago or so, we have this new holiday on the 30th of September about reconciliation with First Nations people. And then when there are First Nations protesters, and some of them are proposed to testify about what they saw, the government's commission chooses not to let them speak.
Yeah.
So there's something really wrong about, I mean, is that about optics? Was there a concern that if Noel Villebrun or Sandra McKenzie from a First Nations treaty in Alberta, if they spoke, would it be clear then to more people that, oh, I guess not all the protesters were angry white men?
Yeah. Well, it definitely feels like government is building a track record of a double standard based on convenience. And you've got multiple things that you can look back to show that. Now, you referenced the thing about a minute ago, just about some of the articles you wrote, because you released a series of articles through Covert Action magazine. That's what you were referring to earlier regarding the convoy. Why do you think that your articles had such a pickup? Why did so many people respond to it?
Well, I mean, I've only read.
Brag on yourself a little bit if you want.
I've just wrote the one article in Covert Action magazine. I did a couple for Propaganda and Focus, which is based in the UK and Germany.
Okay, yes.
Initially, and then I did a number for the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and I've had some other interviews, in Europe and so on, and I mean I think it's a story about that people need. I think because there's the expectation. I mean, I've been a liberal, NDP voter, for most of my life. Voted conservative once, so I'm not the kind of person in this country that would be normally. I mean, I know most of the people in my cohort have given the government the benefit of the doubt and trusted the media, and there's nothing to see here, and they're happy that the prime minister saved the country from insurrectionists.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me that this story just didn't add up, and didn't add up because of all the allegations. Early on, I remember driving. I was listening to the CBC and the radio, and I was hearing about how the truck drivers were being inspired, and there was an instigation to get them to go to Ottawa because of Russian government agents whispering in their ear and saying, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to go to Ottawa?"
Yeah.
I mean, I just think that's just preposterous.
Sure.
And even the CBC ombudsman back in October said that reminded the nation's broadcaster of their public responsibility, and that when they air stories, it has to be based in evidence and fact.
Yeah. Has to be. Absolutely has to be. Otherwise, we move into a world of relativism. And how can you trust anything at that point? Thank you, Ray. Appreciate your time. We're looking forward to doing it again with you at some point.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You are an essential part of this series. Support truth, knowledge, and wisdom by sharing this show with a friend. Visit returntoreason.tv. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter by clicking Become an Insider. Get the latest articles, episodes, and exclusive content. It's Return to Reason.